sort of got into the nitty-gritty of the specific glands, and we started basically superiorly and worked our way inferiorly. So we started off with the pituitary gland. What's the other name for the pituitary?
Hypothesis.
Yeah, hypothesis. I always say that fast. It sounds like a hypothesis, like an educated guess, but it's hypothesis. Let's say it just right. Okay, and it's located on the ventral surface of the brain. What's the name of that stem that it hangs off of? Infundibulum. Okay. And structurally and functionally, there are two parts to the pituitary. What are they? Anterior, also known as the adrenal hypothesis, and posterior, known as the neural hypothesis. Good. All right. What's the name of that little spot that the pituitary sits in? The Turkish saddle?
Sella turcica.
Sella turcica. Okay. All right. Keep in mind that if you looked inside the anterior pituitary, well, let's histologically, if you looked inside the anterior pituitary, what would you see?
Glandular epithelium.
Yeah, you'd see glandular epithelium. You'd see clusters of secretory cells. If you looked in the posterior pituitary, what would you see?
Neurosecretory.
Neurosecretory cells. Basically just the ends of axons from neurons that actually originate where? In the hypothalamus, right? They travel their way down. All right. Going back to the anterior pituitary, keep in mind that all the different hormones that you have, and then there's basically 5 groups of cells that secrete those hormones. Somatotrophs secrete what?
Growth hormone.
Growth hormone, also known as somatotropin. Corticotrophs secrete what? Yeah, ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, also known as corticotropin. What do the thyrotrophs secrete? Thyrotropin, also known as TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. The lactotrophs secrete lactogenic hormone, also known as prolactin. And then the gonadotrophs secrete what? FSH and LH. Good. All right. Growth hormone, as I said, also known as somatotropin. What does growth hormone do? Kind of does what it says, right?
Growing
Protein anabolism.
That's right. That's right. Growth hormone first actually goes to the liver. It stimulates the liver to release insulin-like growth factor. Then insulin-like growth factor goes to the bones, goes to the muscle. Basically causes growth of these tissues. Okay? It accelerates amino acid transport into the cells and promotes protein building. So again, growth hormone is a big anabolic hormone. It causes the formation of proteins. Okay? It promotes fat breakdown. And because it's favoring fat breakdown over carbohydrate breakdown, growth hormone tends to increase blood glucose levels. All right. Therefore, because it's increasing blood glucose levels, you could also think of growth hormone as an antagonist to what?
Insulin.
Insulin's the big one that reduces. Prolactin, what does it do?
Promotes milk secretion.
Yeah, it's promoting development of the breast, and then it's promoting actual secretion of the milk into the glandular portion or the secretory portion of the mammary glands. Does that mean the baby can get at the milk?
No.
No. What other hormone do you need to squeeze it out so the baby can get it?
Oxytocin.
Oxytocin to cause milk letdown or milk ejection. Talking about some of the other anterior pituitary hormones, TSH does what?
Stimulates
Name
the
it says
development.
it, right? It
the
stimulates the thyroid gland to release what?
T3,
T3 and T4. ACTH stimulates the adrenal gland to release its hormones, principally cortisol, but also an effect on aldosterone, which is important during the stress response. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone, right? So we only have it in women, right?
No.
No, all right. We have it in men too. What about luteinizing hormone, right? That's a female thing, so it's just
No.
men, right? Oh, okay. All right, it's men. In women, what does it do? What does FSH do in women? Basically what the name says, it stimulates the follicles to grow. As they grow, they start producing more and more estrogen. What does FSH do in men?
Promotes the development of the testes.
Yeah, it causes the development of the seminiferous tubules.
And spermatogenesis.
And helps with spermatogenesis, and it causes a hormone called ABP to be released. Does anyone remember what ABP was?
Androgen binding protein.
Yeah, androgen binding protein. That's a protein that the seminiferous tubules make that works to lock testosterone into the tubules so you have high enough levels of testosterone so this spermatogenesis can take place. What does LH do in women? What does the name say? Luteinizing hormone. It promotes the formation of the corpus luteum and then the maintenance of that corpus luteum throughout the rest of the monthly cycle. Okay? It's a surge. Remember, it's a surge mid-cycle in LH levels that literally cause ovulation. Where does the corpus luteum come from? It's just that follicle that ruptured and released the egg. It doesn't just go away as soon as it releases the egg. It goes on, and under the effects of LH, it becomes the corpus luteum. All right? Why is the corpus luteum so important? As long as LH levels are high, the corpus luteum stays alive. But why is the corpus luteum so important?
Because it secretes progesterone.
It secretes progesterone, and what does progesterone do? Yeah, it keeps, remember, it's the progestation hormone. It keeps the lining of the uterus intact so you don't shed it, so that the baby has a chance to implant. If the baby doesn't implant during the monthly cycle, there's a natural decrease in LH levels. When LH decreases, the corpus luteum dies. You don't have any progesterone around, so you shed the lining of the uterus. Okay. What about in men? What does LH do in men? Yeah, it stimulates. What cells does it stimulate? Yeah, the interstitial cells, also known as the Leydig cells, to secrete testosterone. Okay. Remember, collectively, FSH and LH are gonadotropins because they're having a stimulatory effect on the gonads. How is secretion in the anterior pituitary controlled?
Through the hypophyseal portal system.
Yeah, through the hypophyseal portal system. What's that?
It takes the hormone directly from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary.
Right, it's a little network of tiny blood vessels that take hormones from the hypothalamus. What are those hormones in the hypothalamus called? Releasing hormones. So they travel from the hypothalamus through that those little blood vessels, go to the anterior pituitary, and they usually cause the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. But there are a few cases where they actually inhibit it. Does anyone remember where you have some inhibition?
Somatostatin.
Somatostatin goes and it inhibits the release of growth hormone and inhibits the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. There's also a PIH, a prolactin inhibiting hormone that goes and inhibits the release of prolactin. All right, very good. What type of feedback system controls endocrine secretions? Positive or negative?
Negative.
It's usually a negative
but there is
system.
also a positive.
What was the textbook figure of a textbook example of a positive feedback system?
Childbirth.
Childbirth, right? So you have that going on with oxytocin. Another example of positive feedback is the baby sucking and getting the milk out. The more the baby sucks, the more milk is squeezed out, and so on and so on. You always need something to break a positive feedback loop. With childbirth, it's getting the sucker out of there. With breastfeeding, it's pulling the sucker off of there, right? Get them away. All right. Posterior pituitary, a little bit easier. How many hormones come from the posterior pituitary?
Two.
Just two, right? What are they?
ADH.
ADH and oxytocin. All right. What's the other name for ADH?
Arginine vasopressin.
Yeah, arginine vasopressin. Honestly, in common usage, they just say vasopressin. What does ADH do?
Water retention.
Yeah, anti-diuretic hormone. It stops you from peeing. It causes pure water reabsorption in the kidney. So it's a good hormone to release when you're what?
Dehydrated.
Dehydrated, or when your blood pressure is low. You'll end up reabsorbing as much water as possible. That'll help raise your blood volume, which will help raise your blood pressure. Your urine, though, will tend to be very concentrated. It'll start to turn darker yellow when you've got ADH around. It's called vasopressin, though, sometimes, because what else does ADH do? It's a vasoconstrictor. Okay, so it's a great hormone for raising blood pressure because it has two ways to do that. Oxytocin, as we mentioned, that causes stimulation of the uterine muscles during childbirth. It also causes stimulation of the little myoepithelial cells that surround the alveolar portion of the mammary glands. And when those myoepithelial cells contract, they squeeze the breast milk out of the secretory part of the mammary gland into the duct part so that the baby can then suck it out. Okay. The pineal gland, Pineal gland secretes melanin, right?
Melatonin.
Oh, melatonin.
You always do that, Dr.
And what does melatonin do?
Controls biological clocks.
Knock you
Yeah,
down.
the body's biological clock. When are levels of melatonin high? When it's darker, okay? It promotes a feeling of sleepiness. When it gets light out, the levels start to go down. Okay. Thyroid gland, as you mentioned, is located in the neck. You have the two lateral lobes. What's the part that connects the lateral lobes? The isthmus, right? You almost have to say it like you have a lisp, the isthmus. If you looked on the posterior surface of the thyroid, what would you find? Parathyroid. Okay, usually 4 of them, but not always. If you look inside the thyroid gland, you're going to see lots of what? Follicles. What's inside the follicles?
Colloid.
Colloid, which represents what? It's basically the storage form of T3 and T4. All right, you have this big, long protein called thyroglobulin, and attached to the tyrosines on that big protein are iodine. Okay, and when 2 tyrosines get together, you can either have the formation of T3 or the formation of T4. When the thyroid gland wants to secrete those products, the follicular cells have to endocytose some of the colloid. They then break off the little bits of T3 and T4, and they release them into the bloodstream. Okay? Because T3 and T4 tend to be hydrophobic, you need to have a carrier protein called thyroxine binding globulin to carry them inside your blood. Okay? T3 and T4 then, they're considered thyroid hormones, so they're the only hormones that your thyroid releases, right? No. No. Okay. What else does it release? I got stuff to do. Calcitonin. What does calcitonin do?
Tones down.
Tones down blood calcium levels. All right. What's the antagonist to calcitonin? PTH. Where does that come from?
Parathyroid.
Okay. If you went and you looked at bone, okay, what effect would PTH have on bone cells?
Osteoclast.
Sure. PTH would stimulate osteoclasts. The osteoclasts would eat away at the bone. They'd release the calcium into the bloodstream, and that would increase your blood calcium levels. What about calcitonin? It decreases the activity of the osteoclasts. It stimulates the activity of the osteoblasts. They pull calcium out of the blood. They use it to build bone. That decreases blood calcium levels. Okay. All right. Adrenal gland, working our way south. We've got the adrenal gland, also known as the suprarenal gland. What are the 2 anatomical and functional parts to the adrenal gland? The cortex and the medulla. All right. The cortex, or excuse me, the medulla, for all intents and purposes, what kind of tissue is in the medulla? It's just like the posterior pituitary. It's neurosecretory tissue, and for all intents and purposes, the adrenal medulla is like a what? Anyone know? A sympathetic ganglion. Okay, and it releases epinephrine and norepinephrine, but instead of putting it into a little synaptic cleft and stimulating another neuron, it releases it into your bloodstream. That's the medulla. Cortex, a little bit more complicated because there's 3 zones or layers to the cortex. What's the outermost zone? The glomerulosa, and it does what type of hormones? Mineralocorticoids, which principally is what? Aldosterone. Okay. What does aldosterone do?
Sodium?
Sodium reabsorption in the kidneys.
Yes.
Okay? Aldosterone causes your kidneys to reabsorb sodium. And when sodium gets reabsorbed due to osmosis, what follows?
Water.
Water. Okay, so similar to what ADH is doing, except ADH does pure water reabsorption, where aldosterone does sodium and then the water follows. Okay. So that's the zona glomerulosa. What's the next layer then? Fasciculata. Okay, what's the principal, what's the category of hormones coming from there? Glucocorticoids. In your body, that means essentially cortisol. All right? Cortisol has a number of effects. It's your stress hormone. It raises blood sugar levels, it promotes protein breakdown, it has an immunosuppressive effect, it assists epinephrine in having